Morning, Simon.
Morning, Paul.
So, Simon, I don't know about you, but in the past few weeks, I've been dealing with trustees of occupational pension schemes seeking advice about contribution holidays. And a number of employers have been asking the trustees whether they'll agree to a break in contributions for several months until this current pandemic passes.
Yeah, I can imagine that businesses up and down the country are concerned to minimise their outgoings during the coming months. We've got employees who are furloughed and businesses that are concerned about their cash position generally. And so a contribution holiday would be very welcome for employers. But I mean, it strikes me that this request is fraught with potential traps for trustees. I mean, certainly there are a number of issues which trustees would have to consider before responding to such a request. I mean, the first and most obvious question, it seems to me, is, do the trustees even have the power to agree a contribution holiday?
You're quite right there, Simon. And there are a number of issues to consider, I think, there. Obviously, the starting point for the trustees is the scheme documentation. The trustees are going to have to review the trustee rules to see what the extent of their powers are and what the employer's powers are in these circumstances.
Yeah.
So, for example, there might be a provision which permits the employer unilaterally to suspend or terminate its liability to pay contributions, but it may well be that power has serious consequences for the scheme, like triggering a winding up, or at least giving the trustees the power to trigger a winding up and so triggering a Section 75 debt.
Well, I mean, that would certainly be an unfortunate and unintended consequence of agreeing a contribution holiday.
Right.
So, I mean, presumably, therefore, it's far more likely that an employer is going to be seeking to agree either a postponement or a reduction in contributions rather than simply exercising a unilateral power that it might have.
Well, I think that's right. And that means that the trustees will have to consider the schedule of contributions and any existing recovery plan. And because the schedule of contributions is a contractually binding agreement between the trustees and the employer, I think any agreement to reduce contributions will have to operate as a variation of the terms of those documents.
Yes, and of course, it's not just a question of the contractual agreement as between the trustees and the employer, of course. I mean, trustees have to have regard to the statutory regime for funding set out in Part 3 of the Pensions Act 2004.
That's right, because Section 227 of the Act contains provisions regarding the preparation and revision of schedules of contributions.
I have to confess, Paul, I didn't learn the sections of the Pensions Act off by heart.
Well, in my defence, I've just been looking at the point, but what the section says is that the trustees can revise the schedule of contributions, but the section also requires the scheme actuary to certify that any revision of any of the schedule will be has to be sufficient for the statutory funding objective to be met by the specified end date.
Yeah, and presumably in these very turbulent economic times, I mean, that could be quite a task for an actuary, and particularly if the scheme valuation isn't particularly recent.
Well, quite. And there's an FAQ on the regulator's website on scheme funding, which hasn't been updated since 2010, which says that the more historic the scheme valuation, the more difficult it will be to justify a certification based solely on conditions at the prescribed valuation date.
So I guess that in those circumstances, trustees might have to obtain an up-to-date estimate of the funding position, taking account of post-valuation experience, for example, before they can agree any revision to the schedule. I mean, after all, a contribution holiday is going to mean a lengthening of the recovery plan if there is one, or a material increase in deficit contributions following the holiday.
Well, absolutely. And of course, it's possible an employer might not be in a position to make increased contributions once the contribution holidays come to an end. So I think, quite rightly, trustees are going to be anxious about agreeing revised schedules, which might prove unaffordable in 6 to 9 months' time.
And as well as that concern, I mean, Paul, won't trustees be equally concerned about the cost of all of this? I mean, agreeing revision to schedules of contributions, instructing actuaries, commissioning up-to-date funding estimates. I mean, not to mention all the time it's going to take to dot the I's and cross the T's. We've got employers who are clamouring for a contribution holiday. I mean, what if the trustees just said, all right, fine, let's take a break and we'll pick up where we left off once life is back to normal?
Well, I mean, I've seen commentators suggesting that course of action, particularly if the proposal is for a relatively short contribution break. And the argument I've seen used is that, well, the trustee can simply agree not to seek to recover any unpaid contributions from the employer for that short period. And it's been suggested that the regulator has somehow endorsed this by relaxing the notification requirements, so that if a breach will be rectified within not more than 3 months and it doesn't have negative impact on the members, then there's no need to report it.
So the trustees in those circumstances might take the view that the regulator has given a green light, as it were, to informal contribution breaks, given the extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah.
I mean, but Paul, quite apart from the reporting requirements, might it not also be said that agreeing to a contribution holiday amounts to a prohibited loan to an employer, and wouldn't the trustees be committing an offence in that case?
Well, you're certainly right to be cautious, Simon, but my view is I don't think the trustees would be subject to penalties in that case. Now, you're right that under Section 40 of the Pensions Act 1995...
You're quoting sections again, Paul.
Okay. Sorry, under the 1995 Act, trustees who agree to make certain prohibited employer-related investments will be committing an offence. But the investment regulations expressly exclude unpaid employer contributions from the scope of Section 40, whether they were payable under a schedule of contributions or otherwise.
Well, fair enough, but what about HMRC in all of this? Well, I mean, what are the tax consequences of unpaid contributions? Might they not be treated as unauthorised employer loans? I mean, I'm aware that Section 179 of the Finance Act 2004...
And now you're quoting sections now.
I'm just following my leader's lead, Paul. But that section sets out very specific conditions which must be met before a loan can be authorised.
Well, you're right. I mean, the position is not clear. I've seen guidance online that suggests the Revenue will take a lenient view on payment holidays on loans due from connected parties or on rent on commercial properties held in pension schemes. And the Revenue says that it's content that any arm's length commercial decisions, including rent holidays, won't give rise to an unauthorised payment charge. Now, of course, it's difficult to describe payment contributions to the scheme as being agreed on commercial terms. But, in these times, it might be that robust contribution holidays, appropriately structured contribution holidays, might be considered to be a loan on commercial terms. And we'll simply just have to watch this space, I think.
Yeah. Well, these are all very interesting points that trustees are going to have to consider. But in the discussion so far, there's one group, very important group, we've not yet considered. And of course, that's the membership. Now, any decision by the trustees to give employers a contribution holiday could be subject to scrutiny and future challenge, either through the courts or to the Ombudsman. I mean, we might see members challenging the validity of any purported exercise of a trust power, for example, saying it's a fraud on a power or an exercise for an improper purpose. Or we might see just complaints of maladministration or for breach of trust.
Indeed, and the losses could end up being substantial. A number of employers might well become insolvent as a result of the economic fallout from the pandemic. And if trustees find it difficult to recover unpaid contributions as a debt, they might face searching questions from the members as to why they failed to ensure the original schedule of contributions was honoured.
And of course, it's not just the foregone contributions themselves which members might allege have been lost, but also any investment performance which would have been achieved on those contributions. I mean, if we're to believe the OBR forecasts, we're going to be rebounding into sunny uplands very quickly. So the investment losses claimed could be very significant indeed.
Well, you're right. And then, if it comes to the trustees trying to rely on exoneration clauses, they might find it very difficult to do that if they seek to rely on those in advance. So
a number of very significant issues for trustees to consider. Paul, what's the bottom line for trustees?
Well, I think they must take advice and they must do it quickly. They must speak to their legal advisors and the scheme actuary. They must liaise with the employer and, as far as possible, keep the membership informed. And they must continue to monitor the guidance from the Revenue and the regulator. I mean, this is a rapidly evolving situation. Guidance is coming thick and fast, and decisions may need to be taken quickly, but they still must be taken carefully and properly.
All good tips. Thanks very much, Paul.
And thank you. Good to speak to you, Simon.